Do we want to move on to Pallas?
Yeah. So just a bit about Pallas astronomically. Pallas kind of belongs to that category of protoplanet, similar to Ceres and Vesta, though Ceres is the only one that gets that minor planet designation. It's still pretty big. I believe it's the third largest object in the asteroid belt. It also has a very eccentric orbit. It's highly inclined, so it's like way off the ecliptic, and it has a similar eccentricity to Pluto. So sometimes it's much closer to the sun than other times in its orbit, which does seem to show up in Pallas' significations, but we'll get there. So Pallas is named after the goddess Pallas Athena, probably primarily known as just Athena. So we'll probably end up using that kind of interchangeably. But Pallas Athena was the daughter of Jupiter, or Zeus, and is the goddess of strategic battle and wisdom. It's also the patron goddess of the city of Athens. So some versions of her mythology, and it's another thing to keep in mind, is that there's a lot of different stories about kind of all these goddesses, but there isn't really you can't really say that there's a canon, but they all kind of become relevant. But some versions of the story have Pallas's not having a mother, but just emerged from Zeus's head. Others have the story going that Zeus swallowed her mother, Metis, it's the goddess of counsel, I believe, maybe might be misremembering, but trying to cover up one of his affairs from Hera.
No way.
Why would you want to do that?
Zeus having an affair.
Yeah. God, Zeus is he's a handful. But yeah, after swallowing her, he got this headache, and on some of the stories, some of the gods had to split his head open with an axe to get her out. But despite all that, Pallas Athena, or just Athena really, at least initially, was Zeus's favorite child. He had a bunch of them. And it's kind of where you get some of the significations associated with Pallas of, daddy's girls. So, where we get Pallas Athena from, just the name. It's in one version of the story. Athena ended up killing her best friend in a sparring match, being sort of overcome with guilt. She took the name in honor of her dead friend, Pallas. Hence you get, Pallas Athena or just Athena. Another version, though, has Pallas as Athena's father, interestingly, who had tried to rape her, and she killed him and took his skin and wore it as a cape, I think, and took his name as kind of part of the trophy, which, while maybe not a big part of the sort of canon that, can't really say exists. Generally, Pallas Athena is, Zeus's daughter. It does, seem to kind of play into some of the themes that show up with Pallas, which you can get kind of from other parts of the story, but relevant nonetheless. Anyway, Zeus made Pallas Athena, along with his other son, Ares, god and goddess of war. They're just kind of in charge of war generally. Pallas is known to be responsible for some of the more, just the strategic and sort of thinking component. The idea of honorable war, gentleman's war, if you will, which it's more of a...
Having a code.
Yeah, a code of ethics with war. That's the thing with Athena that really distinguishes her from Ares. Well, Ares is, kind of just bloodlust mode. Just kind of rush into battle and just kind of go into berserker mode and, slaughter everyone. Pallas, would come up with a plan, have a strategy, and she was distinctly not emotional about her approach to really anything, for the most part. She did have, episodes of emotion, but that is kind of one of the important components of her significations, is that sort of kind of cold, tactical, unemotional approach to things. But as a result, though, she actually repeatedly not only defeated Ares in many of their little spats, she, like, ended up humiliating him on multiple occasions. There is a theme there too of several stories. Which I won't cover all of them, but where she really just, I mean, she ends up showing up a lot of the other male gods. And then another important part of Athena's mythology and eventually significations is that she was a big patron of a lot of heroes from mythology. Like, who was the one that killed Medusa? Do you remember?
Was that Perseus?
Perseus sounds right.
Yes, Perseus.
Yeah, Perseus. Yeah, and she has this strange relationship with Perseus, partly in that she is kind of responsible for creating the monster that he ended up being famous in mythology for killing, and that was Medusa. Now, there's a lot of different versions of this, and you get kind of different versions of Athena depending on which version of the story you go with. They all kind of become relevant, but in one version, basically, Pallas was so pissed that, let's back up. Medusa was originally a priestess and had, certain sacred vows to uphold, one of which was chastity. And I believe it was Poseidon who came down and raped Medusa. And as a result, Athena, just kind of seeing, that, like, oh, she had sex with somebody, so she broke her vow of chastity. She needs to be punished. So she turned her into a Gorgon and eventually sponsored the hero that ended up taking her out. And there's another version where Athena turned Medusa into a Gorgon to give her the power to protect herself against, others who would try to assault her. So you kind of get mixed significations there, all of which, potentially relevant. But so some of the key themes that come up with Pallas center primarily on women taking on traditionally male roles, but it seems also men in traditionally female roles. Women outperforming men and men feeling threatened by women. But you also get women in positions of authority, in some cases seeking approval of male authority figures, unconsciously or consciously. You also get what can come up, it seems like, is like emasculation. Men being, defeated by women in a sense, or what ultimately seems to kind of play out as a sort of questioning of what the actual roles of men and women are, sort of challenging them or merging and blending them. Androgyny seems to come up a lot with Pallas, as well as just kind of the idea of redefining gender roles. And then, of course, you got your strategic thinking. Is there any other significations you want to mention, Tristan?
Yeah, the mythology of Athena is interesting to me. In terms of defying gender norms or gender roles, there's even a role reversal in the story of her birth.
Mm-hmm.
Where, when you think about it, Zeus gives birth. This patriarchal male sky god, the most masculine possible god you could think of in this cultural context, kind of goes into labor. In the story, he has this horrible migraine and he needs one of the other gods to cleave his head open with an axe in order to give birth to his daughter.
That's an excellent
So
point.
there's a role reversal even in that story. But yeah, there's her relationships with women, with other women in her mythology are very interesting. They're not great. There's the myth of Orestes. Orestes is, I won't tell the whole story from beginning to end because it's quite long and detailed, but essentially Orestes is put on trial for killing his own mother. And, that the Erinyes, the monstrous beings who will chase after people who've broken the laws of fate, who've broken sort of the moral laws of the universe, go after Orestes for killing his mother. Um, but he gets this trial, and it's actually Athena who casts the deciding vote that Orestes is innocent. And the argument in favor of his innocence, I can't remember who delivers the argument originally. Um, it's a it's a male figure who says, basically, the father is the only true parent of a child, that a woman is basically just a nurse. That it's the father's seed that creates the child. So the woman is just like someone who takes care of it for a while, but not actually, she doesn't actually have any rights over the child. Um, and Athena, the vote is totally split, and Athena hears this argument and she says, well, I was born without a mother, so this logic holds true as far as I'm concerned. And she casts a vote that Orestes is innocent, that it's not killing a parent if he kills his own mother, basically, which
Mm-hmm.
is like a pretty upsetting
That's
tale.
a pretty also big jump. It's a bit of a stretch logically.
It is a huge stretch.
I think the takeaway that I sort of take from that story and others is that given the very patriarchal structure of Greek society and even Mount Olympus, they're pretty tolerant of Athena, taking on these masculine male roles. And part of that, I think, is that she is supporting that. She's supporting the patriarchy
She's
in a sense.
Yeah.
She's not questioning those rules. She's really going along with them and really, at least in most stories, kind of part of that system, sort of getting its
Yeah.
approval.
Yeah, she's kind of denying her own femininity and upholding the
Yeah.
patriarchy. There's another one of her famous myths is her weaving battle with Arachne.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Athena, not only was she the goddess of wisdom and warfare and the city of Athens, but she was also a goddess of artisans and craftspeople, particularly weaving. So Arachne was an extremely skilled weaver, and thought that she was better even than Athena, and they end up, Athena gets really pissed off about that, and they end up having kind of a weave off where they both create these beautiful tapestries.
Yeah.
um, at the end of the day, it does not end very well for Arachne. So it's just another
Is that the one that's where
example
she
of,
turns her into a spider, right?
yes, she ends up, well, Arachne originally hangs herself, because she's so distraught over the results of her interaction with Athena. And Athena actually takes some pity on her and turns her into a spider. But nonetheless, it's just like in every single tale. I mean, Athena was also one of three goddesses who, is involved in the story of the beginning of the Trojan War, where the goddess of chaos, Eris, she's not invited to a party, basically. And in her anger, she inscribes on a golden apple something like, for the most beautiful, and throws the golden apple into the party. And Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera all fight over this apple, and then Paris, the hero, has to choose, between them for some reason. I don't know all the details of the story, but
Yeah.
it's just like every single story where Athena is involved with other women in some way, she seems to be like not in a very, um I don't know, maybe there are examples. There's the example of Pallas, like that was her best friend, but she also killed her. Like it just never seems to end well for women when they have
Yeah.
encounters with Athena.
Yeah. No, it's like an aside thought. I do kind of like to think of Greek mythology as a little bit like a sitcom sometimes, because it's almost like not about the story itself. It's about, putting the characters in this situation and,
Hmm.
learning something about the character, or the character learns something about themselves, in that situation. But
Hmm.
yeah, you're right. It doesn't seem to go well for women around her. So yeah, she does seem to really kind of deny a lot of the traditional feminine roles, like motherhood as well. I mean, she was one of the virgin goddesses. I think there was one situation where, one story of where I can't remember, terrible with the
It was
names.
Hephaestus.
Was it Hephaestus that tried to?
Yeah, Hephaestus tried to have
Yeah,
his way with her, and she fought
yeah,
him off.
yeah. She fought him off. It was almost kind of like it's really makes Hephaestus sound really pathetic. Yeah, he kind of blows one on her thigh, and she kind of like brushes it off, and with a rag drops it on the ground, and that rag impregnates Gaia, right, the Earth, and births this baby, this kind of half god. It's like a demigod baby, right? And it's not really her responsibility. I mean, it's not hers. And even if it was, she might not think that it's not actually her baby. If nonetheless, she does take responsibility for it. So I mean, there is like a highly principled element to Athena's personality, perspective, and approach to things, but not maternal. She puts the baby in a box. I think she can't remember where she goes exactly, but she basically is like, "All right, I'm leaving this box here. There's a snake in there who's gonna, nurture and protect this baby." The snakes were very much associated with like wisdom, so I mean, it kind of makes sense that she would have a snake raise this baby in a sort of Greek mythology logic sort of way. But I guess there were some women around that saw her leave the box, and they hear a baby crying, and these women, even though Athena told them not to open the box, just leave it. They end up opening the box, and depending on which version of the story you hear, they, one way or the other, they all end up dead, either eaten by the snake or.
It really never ends well for women in
Yeah,
these stories.
yeah. And I mean, it's just like Athena, like, I don't have time for this, like, yeah, I'll do, the decent thing. I'll give you a box, baby. Granted, I think she does end up like training the baby when he gets older. It's just very, it's just not maternal. The instinct isn't
Hmm.
terribly maternal with Pallas.
Yeah, it's more dutiful. It's like, well, Hephaestus is not going to take responsibility for this because men in this culture do not. So, you
Yeah,
know,
why would I
I
do that?
guess I'll do something about it so that this baby doesn't just die. It's really more of a sense of moral obligation than it is, an actual desire to nurture the child.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess that's what I find just interesting about the whole story, or what it makes me wonder what exactly it was, what it triggered, with the Greeks, like what sort of things got brought up. Because I mean, the Athenians at least they named their city after her, and this is a level of research I haven't gotten into, but I think generally, I mean, you get what maybe kind of from a modern perspective is a woman who doesn't really recognize the distinction between male and female roles, at least not as far as they apply to her. Um, that she, in a sense, like, oh well, if men aren't responsible for nurturing and doing this and that with babies, like why should I? Which is fair. I kind of find it, I don't know, something about the figure of Pallas Athena that really sort of forces, at least maybe from the modern perspective, men to challenge, their own kind of traditional role. Like, well, maybe if I'm having this negative reaction to what she's doing, maybe I should be held to the same standard, as maybe I'm
Hmm.
holding women to.
Did we want to maybe get into some examples? Did you want to share your own personal example?
Yeah. So Pallas is really the one that I would say is most responsible for selling me on asteroids, at least initially. And now I can see them. So I have Pallas in an exact conjunction with Mars in my chart. It's within 10 minutes. It's a very tight one. And for me, Mars rules my 10th and my 5th houses. It's pretty connected to my chart, either by aspect or rulership. But I found some of the symbolism there really hard to ignore, especially when, while I can maybe see some of the themes more broadly in my chart, the palace element really seemed to add some specificity. Like, for example, maybe one of the really kind of simple ones is that Mars rules it's the dispositor of my moon. Moon being associated with the mother. And also rules my 10th house, so that does traditionally get associated with the mother sometimes. Not one that I always used, but there could be some connection there. But my mother was a lieutenant colonel in the Army. Another element of that shows up quite prominently, having Mars, ruling my 5th house. It's like the house of children is, when my son was first born, his mom was going to college, and I ended up taking on a lot of the maybe roles traditionally prescribed to women, or to mothers. I remember getting a lot of Mr. Mom jokes at the time. And not that that's uncommon at all these days. But, ruling my 10th, I was a massage therapist for about 10 years. And that is a traditionally more of a female-dominated industry. And even, astrology is probably, both the consumers and the practitioners of astrology are probably a majority of women. My partner, Megan, she has Pallas hanging out with her first house ruler. And while, she may not necessarily recognize it, I definitely see her as a very strong kind of Pallas type, a kind of strong-willed and assertive woman who's not, afraid to stand up for herself. I would say that those types of women have been a big part of my life. And I guess maybe seeing that conjunction maybe made me realize how much that's a very distinct part of my life that is maybe not something that I tend to take for granted, but something that is maybe not the norm for most people.
Do you want to tell the story about shooting your friend in the teeth? Because that was my favorite. That was the clincher for me.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I really loved playing airsoft, right? Those little, not quite BB guns, but, you shoot and they hurt. And, as long as you wear goggles, you're probably fine. But on 2 occasions, I accidentally shot 2 different friends' front teeth out with the airsoft gun, leaving giant gaping holes in the front of their mouth. In both cases, their parents had to run them off to, emergency dental. I don't know. I guess there's emergency dentists, but I remember they had to leave immediately. And nobody ever wanted to play airsoft with me again. And I also felt extremely guilty. Fortunately, I didn't get, the worst case scenario of that. I didn't kill any friends. But I did.
You didn't have to take on their names in front of yours in honor of accidentally killing them with airsoft guns.
Yeah. It also probably bears noting that Mars is in an overcoming square with a bunch of 11th house planets, which just kind of adds to that.
Yeah.
Pallas,
Athena, and Mars are literally overcoming the planets in Kyle's 11th house, which represent friendship.
Yeah. So, don't be afraid to be friends with me, though, everybody.
I haven't lost any teeth yet.
Yet.
Yeah.
You haven't played airsoft with me yet, apparently.
This is part of the fun and excitement, though.
Yeah, that's the thing is I'm like Pallas, if you get in a sparring match with me, it just goes... just go into full warrior mode and you might die. But that's another big Pallas thing. God, there's just so many. I love strategy games. strategy video games. My dad,
Fifth House.
Fifth House, my dad introduced me to them. I even went to some really nerdy war game conventions, and I just love it. I love strategy, chess, anything that has to do with outwitting your opponent. Uh, it's great.
Yeah, this
So
is my delineation now. If you have Mars conjunct Pallas ruling your fifth house, this is the way you like to have fun.
it is. Yeah, and that's another part of it too. Is it's just tell everybody all my personal secrets. Mars is in my eighth house, and it's the eighth house is uh, traditionally called the idle place. And one way that Mars conjunct Pallas in my eighth house has maybe manifested that signification is one way that I um, have maybe gotten myself into trouble by not doing the things I'm supposed to do, is by playing strategy video games instead. This is a problem of mine for a while that I had to pry myself away. Still, if a really good game is coming out, I can't even I can't look at any previews for it, because I'm if I start playing that, my productivity is just gone for a good month. So yeah, that's the other thing. It's Malefics. They not everything they deliver is awful. Some of it's rather mundane or even fun. Like, there's nothing wrong with liking strategy war games. Just tending to overdo it, which I think maybe a lot of people with Mars ruled fifth houses might have to be careful of.
Not me.
Not
I never
Tristan
overdo
with
anything.
his exalted Mars ruling. And I think that's the thing with exalted malefics, is they're just no fun. You don't have to have
I
any
mean,
fun
I
with them.
was I was fun when I was younger, but it was very much to my detriment. So I mean, that's the thing with Mars, is going from one extreme to the other. I was a typical Mars ruled fifth house person and partied way too hard and was just hell bent on self destruction. And then the pendulum swung to the opposite extreme, and now, I have responsible fun. I have appropriately Mars and Capricorn fun, but I had to explore the opposite extreme first before that happened. Now, who knows? Maybe it will swing the other way.
Yeah, maybe yeah, be your midlife crisis or something. No,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
yeah. I think maybe just a general lesson about malefics is that, yeah, they just tend towards extremes. I
Yeah.
similarly, after becoming a parent, especially, really had to rein in some of those Mars ruled fifth house activities in order to be a responsible parent.
Should I maybe get into Pallas and Katherine Hepburn's chart?
Yes, do.
So, Katherine Hepburn, as I mentioned earlier, had Scorpio rising, and she had the moon and Pallas conjunct in Taurus in her seventh house, um, opposing, Juno, who I discussed earlier. And so, again, we're sort of fleshing out and giving more detail to what her relationships were like, being someone who was very independent and very much married to her work in a lot of ways. And, Athena being a virgin goddess, being someone who, didn't answer to a husband. But I think, Pallas being conjunct the moon really came across in her personality. She was known for being very spirited, and the characters that she played.
Assertive too,
Yes,
especially for time period.
yeah. I mean, she
Not afraid to
was
butt heads with.
she was born in 1907.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
She was very known for. I mean, she was actively involved in the like women's suffrage and stuff, right? Or was it?
yep.
Yeah.
Her mom, both of her parents were very progressive. And her mother would go to Votes for Women demonstrations, and Catherine would join her mom at those demonstrations.
Yeah.
The household really encouraged freedom of speech and, open debate on various topics. Her parents were actually like they would get in some trouble in their community for being so progressive. They caused a bit of a stir.
Mhm.
So, and she was described as a tomboy as a child. She actually had a male name for herself. She would call herself Jimmy and cut her hair
Mhm.
short. And her dad taught all of the children various athletic skills, swimming, running, wrestling, all that kind of stuff. And he taught the
She wasn't a
kids
daddy's girl, was she?
maybe a little. I don't know. She stayed, from what I've read, she remained close to both of her parents throughout her
Mm.
life. But her dad taught the kids to play golf, and that in particular became one of Catherine's early passions. At one point, she was taking daily lessons, and she got so good that she reached the semifinal of the Connecticut Young Women's Golf Championship.
Mm.
She also she really liked swimming, and she used to take ice cold swims every morning, saying that the bitterer the medicine, the better it is for you. Which just really that really
Yeah.
feels Athena to me.
That is, yeah. It's thinking of She-Ra. I don't know if you're familiar.
I I really need to watch that show.
Female equivalent of He-Man.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty
The
great.
like recent reboot. I've seen a couple episodes of it and it's really good, but I haven't seen enough of it. Um my favorite, there's this beautiful image of Katherine Hepburn in one of her early roles, literally dressed up in this like mythological Greek Amazon garb. So like just
Yeah.
literally looking like Athena. So this early role was a film called The Warrior's Husband, and this film tells the story of the Amazons who possessed the sacred girdle of Diana. And so, in this society that's portrayed in this film, women actually play the traditionally male role in their society, where they have all the positions of political
Mm.
power and they're the warriors. And it's the men who stay at home and care for children and play sort of a subordinate role. So, the drama in this film is that, Hercules steals the girdle of Diana, and that's when this role reversal happens. And then men come to take on the positions of power in a society. It's so fitting.
It's just too perfect. I don't know. And it's Conjunct the moon ruling. It's her fifth house, right? Or is it her
Her
ninth?
ninth house
Oh,
is
ninth.
Cancer.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, she had some pretty strong political beliefs too, as I recall.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of my thoughts too are coming from the watch the movie The Aviator. Uh, Kate Blanchett did a great job portraying Katherine Hepburn, but there's a scene where Howard Hughes is kind of meeting her family for the first time, and like they're just having this like really um, impassioned like political discussion at the table, like very like liberally oriented one. And I think Howard Hughes being more conservative, like it's like really, I don't know, I think he gets like really upset about it. But um, regardless, yeah, that it's I feel like Palace is just having her way with Katherine Hepburn's moon there.
Yeah, there's so many of her roles exemplify this archetype. There is, I know,
Yeah.
I spent a bunch of today just looking at clips of Katherine Hepburn in her various roles, and now I feel like I need to
Mhm.
go deeper into the rabbit hole and just binge a whole bunch of Katherine Hepburn movies. There's one
Yeah.
uh, well-known movie she was in called Adam's Rib, and she played a defense attorney, and the person she was defending in this film was a woman accused of shooting her cheating husband. And the drama in the movie comes from the prosecuting lawyer actually being the husband of Katherine Hepburn's character. So they end up kind of on opposite sides of this legal battle about this woman who's been accused of killing her husband for infidelity. It's just It's very modern day Pallas Athena.
I mean, you get
Yeah,
Juno on the
yeah,
ascendant there too. It's like, well, in the opposing the debate, I don't know. That's
yeah. There's a
interesting.
lot. I mean, all three of other than Ceres, although Ceres is still pretty close to Jupiter in the ninth house in Katherine Hepburn's chart. So it's not a non-event in her chart, but Juno and Pallas and Vesta are all very. She has one asteroid conjunct each of the big three in her chart.
Yeah,
So it's just like all those goddess archetypes are really kind of showing up through her body of work.
yeah, yeah, it's nuts. Well, I have another Palace example. So you have more to
Ooh.
say on Katherine Hepburn.
Oh no, I think we've covered her pretty well.
Yeah, so the example that I have here is Kesha. Kesha has Pallas within a degree of conjunction with her ascendant. Now, technically, it's an out of sign conjunction. Pallas is at 20, 29 degrees, 34 minutes. Her ascendant's about 33 minutes. So it's like a degree. But in the case of like an angle, you can definitely see planets, even if they're out of sign, conjunct the degree of the ascendant or the midheaven or one of the prominent angles. They're still very, very visible. So with Kesha, I'm glad you brought up Pallas being also the god of craftsmanship, being highly skilled in your given craft. And Kesha actually very skilled songwriter. She wrote, I believe, over 200 songs for other artists. Some of them hits, I think, a couple for Britney Spears. The names are escaping me. She also, wrote or co-wrote all the songs on her first two albums. One of her albums was called Warrior.
It's so perfect.
I know it, and that's what's interesting too is that Mars, is not prominent in her chart, at least not visible, super visible. It's in Taurus. It's in the sixth house, but she does have a very Mars quality that comes out in her performances, her sort of attitude, and it is very much rebelling against a lot of traditional gender norms. I think one of the things I always sort of appreciated about Kesha's her music videos and songs is just very she sort of takes on a male role in a traditionally male role in she, like what TikTok, which was the longest running number one hit by a female artist since 1971, back in 2009. And it's like waking up in the morning feeling like P. Diddy. In the interview with her, she said that I woke up in the morning one day and I was feeling like a pimp, which just like that, I don't know, the traditional male role of being a pimp or whatever, but just like feeling, that empowered kind of sense of I can do what I want that, maybe traditionally was reserved for men. Her sort of donning that and taking that and owning it and empowering, other women to feel that way too and it be okay. Kesha is also openly pansexual. I believe she's also served as a officiator of many same-sex and opposite-sex marriages. She's like pretty outspoken advocate for marriage equality. And just a side note, it's a not Pallas thing. It's actually a Ceres thing. She has Ceres conjunct Uranus in her first house. And one of the more challenging significations of Ceres is eating disorders. And she did struggle with bulimia for a period of time. But maybe one of the more interesting and complicated things that seem to show up for her is her, I believe, over decade-long public legal battle with Dr. Luke, her producer. I know it's such a complicated case that I don't want to speak on it too much. Sounds to me like the main dispute is that Dr. Luke raped her, did all kinds of sexual psychological abuse, and really has been kind of using his leverage, from his powerful position to kind of keep her in the contract. And actually, more recently, this is a big story that I'm not going to do justice, but uh, I believe the initial rape allegations were dropped by the courts. So it became a countersuit where Dr. Luke countersued her for defamation and breach of contract. And then, I believe that, there's been a lot of countersuits involved between both of them. And I think what I find interesting, most relevant, is this has been going on for a long time. At one point, Dr. Luke did try to make a deal with her, like, hey, drop the rape allegations. I will drop, my breach of contract countersuit and everything. And she's like, no, I'd rather, it's about like the principle. It's about, getting justice. It's not about like what's convenient for her. It just seemed like a very Athena mindset, is that, that is why, partially why, the Athenians chose her as their deity, is the, the justice seeking element of Athena. Granted, she did have some nasty revenge components. She could get riled up, but for the most part, she tried to be fair. Nonetheless, a lot of this was going on during the Me Too movement, and she did receive, like a ton of support from the artistic community and just the public at large. It seems like recently, Dr. Luke kind of lost his suit due to a new law that is really trying to address the way that, which rich white men are able to use the legal system, to basically barrage people with countersuits and legal technicalities that keep them from, speaking out against them. And that has been working to her advantage. And, it doesn't look like the final outcome of these legal battles are anywhere near over, but, it does seem to have turned in her favor, over the last few years. You kind of get that theme of just really challenging the sort of structural authority that men have, and recognizing that imbalance and seeking to rectify that. That shit ain't right, right?
Damn right. I'm thinking about the way mythic archetypes evolve over time relative to the culture they find themselves in. And as people start questioning, patriarchal norms, and start fighting against systemic discrimination against women and non-binary people, and basically, people who are not straight cis men who've, dominated our social institutions for quite a long time, that the archetype of Athena sort of evolves alongside that. I'm actually personally a polytheist, and a question that often gets asked, of people who work with, some of these actual deities is, how can you have a relationship with a deity who's done these horrible things in their stories? And that sort of idea of mythic literalism, that the stories of the gods are literally the deeds of the gods. I don't think that's necessarily how ancient people understood their myths, and it's certainly not how I think most. I can't speak for all polytheists, but you know, I don't meet many polytheists who take the myths literally. It's more a case of, people have an experience of something that seems sacred or divine and they give it a name, but then they have to refer back to their own culture in order to flesh out what they've experienced. And so if they have this experience of a divine sense of female authority within an extremely patriarchal, extremely misogynistic culture, you end up with these kinds of stories where like there's a bit of conflict inherent in the classical Athena stories, where there's a kind of rejection of other women that goes on in these stories. And I guess I'm, looking at Pallas in actual birth charts of, modern people,
Hmm.
makes me kind of hopeful that our experience of that archetype is starting to change.
Well, you think of like how that archetype would function in Greek society,
Yeah.
which is very patriarchal and male dominated. How that archetype functions is, just taking on to some degree, the qualities of patriarchal structure it's in, and that being sort of how she is able to exercise the power that she has, and even
Yeah.
Zeus, like getting the validation from her father, her only parent, for doing that, you know, there's a lot of motivation there for her to keep supporting that system. And I could definitely see how that theme can show up in people's charts as well. But like you were saying, kind of the evolving cultural landscape. There's like versions of these myths
Hmm.
that predate even the Greeks, and that were very different depending on the context. I think there are a lot of astrologers now who are working with kind of pre-patriarchal versions of the myths, which is not something
Hmm.
I know enough about to speak on, but there's definitely a lot of nuance to the way these archetypes can be used.
Yeah, it's like in an extremely patriarchal system, the only way for a woman to have power is to align herself with that system and against
Hmm.
other women, which you see in the
Yeah.
classical mythology around Athena. You see illustrated really clearly in the myth of Orestes in that trial where, she says, that in that myth, she says, I'm on the side of male supremacy, essentially.
Hmm. Yeah.
And then you see figures like Katherine Hepburn or like Kesha, who are not necessarily aligning themselves with the dominant male institution in order to have power. They're claiming it for themselves.
Yeah.
So that's a big shift away from the only way I can have power is to kind of side with the patriarchy versus no, I'm going to claim my own power, which it is my birthright to have this power and to have agency, and it is over and against the patriarchy instead of siding with it.
Hmm. And I think that's a really good point, because so much of the Athena archetype is just the a word like entitlement gets has like negative connotations into it, but like that was just Athena from the start. Like that was who Athena was. And
She
maybe one
was
of the things
born a
that's
warrior, fully clad in
yeah,
armor. She emerged
she
from
was,
Zeus's
yeah,
head wielding a spear.
fully
Like she
grown,
was just
yeah,
powerful
an
right from
adult.
the get go.
Hmm. But I think, yeah, with like Kesha, one of the things so attractive about her is that, yeah, she does have that, like she exudes that, like I'm entitled to this power. Like it's
Hmm.
not up for debate or to be questioned. It just is. And
Yep.
I think that's part of what the archetype is about.
Should we move on to Vesta?
Yeah, it's a good idea.
All right. I will start with some astronomical notes on Vesta, which is the brightest asteroid visible from Earth. It can at times be faintly visible to the naked eye. Even though it's not the biggest of the asteroids, it's extremely reflective, which is kind of neat because Vesta is the goddess of the hearth fire. So the brightness and reflectiveness of the asteroid is symbolically relevant here. There's another fun astronomical fact about Vesta that makes it unique. And I'm quoting from the Max Planck journal here. The asteroid Vesta is unique. Unlike all other minor planets that orbit the Sun within the main belt between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, Vesta has a differentiated inner structure. A crust of cooled lava covers a rocky mantle and a core made of iron and nickel, quite similar to the terrestrial planets Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. Scientists therefore believe this onion like asteroid to be a protoplanet, a a relic from an early phase of planet formation more than 4.5 billion years ago. All other protoplanets either accumulated to form planets or broke apart due to violent collisions. And another shorter way of making this point, just from Wikipedia, is Vesta is the only known remaining rocky protoplanet with a differentiated interior of the kind that formed the terrestrial planets. So it's a
Hmm.
really interesting piece of the history of our solar system.
I thought Ceres and Pallas were both protoplanets.
Maybe they are, and it's just that they're not.
Different kind.
Yeah, they don't have that differentiated interior that makes them, the same kind of protoplanet that formed the Earth or Mercury.
It's more like reading the differentiated interior as being like the main thing. But yeah, I don't.
Yeah. And I haven't, really
Sorry.
that's okay. I haven't really figured out, how what this might symbolize if we're trying to draw some symbolism from the astronomy, but if
Hmm.
any listeners are interested um, in what that might mean, what sort of meaning we might attach to it, there it is.
Sort of thinking about how we'll get into, might be getting ahead a little, but how Vesta, the goddess, doesn't really have any images of her. Almost like really she's just kind of represented as like an object, like a torch.
Yeah.
It's almost like a, I don't know, like a disembodied planet.
Yeah. Well, maybe I think the cult of Vesta was the last one when Rome was Christianized to be totally disbanded. So maybe there's a bit of a last one standing kind of symbolism there.
Mm. Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, that makes sense.
And there is also a group of smaller asteroids with a composition similar to Vesta that were probably created from a huge impact. And they hang around in the same area, and they are called Vestoids. So I find that
Oh,
very fitting since
Vesta
the
has a
cult of
cult.
Vesta, yeah, has, well, not just any cult, but has a dedicated group of
Hmm.
people who are constantly attending her flame at all times. The Vestal Virgins.
Vestoids, Vestal virgins.
Yep.
That's interesting. I like that.
Yeah, I thought that was fun. So, mythologically, Vesta was the Roman goddess of the hearth, home, and family. And her Greek equivalent is Hestia, who is also a goddess of hearth, home, and family. There isn't a lot of mythology around this goddess in either one of these iterations, but the cult to Vesta in ancient Rome is pretty fascinating. Like Kyle was saying, the there wasn't really like a human sort of personification for Vesta. She was mostly just symbolized by her sacred fire, which in the temple to Vesta was never allowed to go out. So the Vestal virgins were tasked with maintaining this sacred fire, and it was symbolic of the whole state of Rome. Vesta was a virgin goddess. Um, I believe in the Greek myth, Hestia refuses to marry anybody. And interestingly, in Roman religion, she was given the title of mother, and she has some connection with agriculture. So, sort of an interesting paradox there of like a virgin goddess who's also referred to as mother. Um,
Yeah, that overlap with Cirrus a little bit.
yeah, so the Vestal Virgins were chosen when they were children between the ages of 6 and 10 and taken from their families to serve for a 30-year contract in the Temple of Vesta. And their duties were tending the sacred fire. They made mola salsa, which was a salted flour that was used to consecrate Roman sacrifices, like in public sacrifices. So in a sense, the Vestal Virgins were like the state's housekeepers. They were serving this kind of domestic role, but that role was for the entire state and not just for one individual household.
Yeah,
And
wasn't it like the fire went out? Like that was. signal like the doom of Rome or something.
Well, it signaled at the very least that Vesta had abandoned Rome, which would be a
Yeah.
bad thing. And
Mm-hmm.
if any one of the Vestals allowed the fire to go out, she was punished.
Yeah, quite brutally.
Yeah, it's like many things in the ancient world, it was an interesting lifestyle. The Vestal Virgins had a lot of rights that other women did not have in ancient Roman society. They were very, very, very honored. Um, when they became priestesses, they were legally emancipated from their father's authority. And, in public places, they were given the right of way at public games or performances. They had a place of honor that was reserved for them. They did not need to take an oath in order to give evidence. It was customary for anyone giving evidence to swear an oath. And in the case of the Vestals, their word was just trusted without question. Um, they were entrusted with wills and state documents. The penalty for injuring them was death, and they could free condemned prisoners or slaves just by touching them. If a person sentenced to death happened to see a Vestal on their way to being executed, they were automatically pardoned. So they
Mm.
had this like very unique and sort of powerful position in society.
It's interesting to me that the Vestal Virgins being like the tenders of the attendees of the sacred fire, um, attendees of this like sacred thing, which kind of by proxy makes them sacred. But then anything that it's almost like anything they touch or see or anything that like interacts with them kind of becomes sacred as well. Like it makes me think of like signing an autograph or something. Like somebody famous signs a basketball. Suddenly that basketball goes from a $10 value to like a $10,000 value.
Yeah, the when the 30-year contract was done, the Vestals were released from their duties and they were given permission to marry, and they were very sought after.
Mm. Oh
Marriages were
yeah.
generally arranged with, people who were well to do, and it was supposed to be very good fortune to marry a former Vestal Virgin. Another sort of interesting fact, there are some, along with the sort of paradox of the goddess Vesta being at once a virgin, but also associated, I guess, to some extent with fertility if she was being referred to with the title of mother. The Vestal Virgins tended the cult of a sacred phallus that acted as a token of the safety of Rome. So this sacred phallic image was contained, I guess, in the temple, and they looked after it. And they also hung an effigy of this sacred phallus on underneath the chariot of a general to protect him. So there's some weird, like there were a lot of phallic amulets that were used as protective magic in ancient Rome, but there is this interesting connection between the Vestal Virgins and that particular image, which is interesting because, when I was reading Demetra's book on the asteroid goddesses, she talked about seeing clients who had Vesta very prominent in their charts, and she was kind of expecting them, to be more, not necessarily celibate, but I guess, leaning a little more that way. And what she actually found were a lot of stories of exploring like non-traditional sexual relationships. So there's this sort of like the whole issue of sexuality and, the whole spectrum of it, I think is very much connected to the Vesta archetype in astrology.
Yeah. Like almost think about it as just kind of presenting this idea of sexuality and sacredness, and what I don't know. You think about just the myth, the Vestal, maybe not the myth, but the Vestal Virgins themselves. They gave up basically in order to get the privileges, some of which, are just what were afforded to men in general, but to get like extra privileges. But sort of the price for emancipation, from being like subordinate to men was giving up their sexuality in a
Yeah,
sense.
like giving up any sort of intimacy with men.
I mean, literally.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, oh, well, there's something weird about that. And it does seem to be a recurring theme, just like in society. I don't know, the idea that from a lot of men's perspective, like, oh, once I can't have sex with you anymore, now I can respect you and treat you as an equal.
Yeah, that it is something that you see. I mean, it's still a problem in our culture now.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, just to specify, what I meant earlier by non-traditional sexual relationships, what Demetra said she noticed with her clients was like specifically non-monogamy or, being intimate outside of a like partnered relationship. Which is interesting
Hmm.
because it's like there's still intimacy going on, but it's happening outside of, a traditional monogamous relationship with one other person, um, which is obviously not virginity, but it's still kind of like the Vestal virgins were exceptional because they were not married and they did not have, this sort of socially sanctioned sexual relationship.
Yeah, something I would like to maybe to study Vesta more would be to like see how a prominent Vesta plays out uh, in the context of like what aspects it's making with other planets.
Hmm.
I would imagine that the other planets, even like just a sign-based configuration, is going to maybe influence that planet, similar to the way it would, with the traditional planets.
I do have Vesta in the first house in my own chart. And one of the areas of emphasis Demetra George puts on Vesta in her work is devotion, having a devotional spirituality,
Mm-hmm.
and that actually very much rings true for me. I've
Yeah,
been
don't you do some of that like tradition, that devotional practice?
just a little,
That devotional practice to the gods.
just a bit. I've been unusually religious for my entire adult life, and I wasn't raised particularly religious, and I tend to be pretty skeptical. So it's just odd that I keep kind of getting pulled into it. But I was actually, I worked in the church for about 3 years. And I was pretty active in the church in the years prior to that. And I have always had, I practiced some non traditional spirituality when I was younger as well, like witchcraft and dabbled in paganism a bit. So whether I was um, following a pagan or a Christian spiritual path, I have always had an altar in my home. And the center of Vesta's cult is the hearth, is the domestic area of devotion and sacrifice. I've never not had a space for that in my home, and it has never not been sort of like the most important part of my home, and an area of central focus. But like maybe the most, and I do like have a tendency towards very ecstatic religious experiences, which Demetra talks about in her book too, as being a very Vesta type signification. Um, to the point that at one point in my life, maybe, and I guess like 4 years ago, something like that, um, I was dating someone, um, but wasn't really serious yet. But I sat at my altar to pray one night and ended up having an ecstatic religious experience. And after having that experience, I did not want to be in a relationship. I just wanted to do my practice and to pray, and I ended up leaving that relationship. And there was a period of time where I seriously considered like taking a vow of celibacy and just being like, I don't really feel like being in relationships at all. Like I'm good to just I'm really getting my emotional and spiritual needs met from my devotional practice. So it felt kind of like a distraction. And like as a kid, I used to think about, joining a monastery and stuff like that. Ultimately, that did not end up being the path I took, but it's kind of interesting that I've got Vesta in the first house, and that was at least a serious consideration at some point in my life, which is maybe odd. Like, I don't think a lot of people uh, seriously consider walking
Yeah,
that particular path.
I think that your Vesta example was really maybe one of the ones that sold me on Vesta, was the one that sold me on Vesta, because, we do have very similar charts. Not that they're exactly the same, but like I have Vesta and it's in the second house. It's like the one asteroid that's not really doing anything. It's, my one little bit of fire, which seems appropriate, but I want to keep it tucked away in my second house. But that's something that, like, yeah, I've never been. I just have the cynical part of religion. I do not have any of the devotional practice element. But I don't know. What you're saying kind of makes me think about, the idea of, taking time, which is not like an uncommon practice for people, like take time out of a relationship to like find yourself again, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
And thinking of, yeah, about like, what it's like the price of intimacy is sort of, I don't know, it's like you're mixing your fire with someone else's, is it sacred anymore? Or does it, I don't know, like Vesta like brings up this question of asking you like, what is your sacred space? Is that something physical or is it something deeper?
Is it something that you would be willing to share or potentially sacrifice in order to be in a relationship with somebody else?
Yeah.
Yeah, as there's a lot.
Can you maintain that in the context of relationship?
Yeah, exactly. Maintaining your own. And I mean, that's also something Demetra um, emphasizes in her interpretation of Vesta, is this kind of idea of being self-contained and independent. Um, so, perhaps there's Vesta might bring up some questions around that, because when you are in a relationship, what is yours becomes your partner's, and what is your partner's becomes yours. Your lives start to mix together, and you can still maintain some independence in a relationship, but you become more interdependent, and the line or where I start and where my partner begins, that isn't always totally clear when your lives are really meshed together. Um, it's another asteroid that is prominent in the chart of Katherine Hepburn, who is just all the asteroids going on in her chart. Vesta was conjunct her sun within a couple of degrees in the seventh house. And I know there's been I've heard some sort of like reinterpretations of the concept of the Virgin as being sort of like a self contained woman, or like someone who is independent, essentially not controlled by a man within a patriarchal society. Like the Vestal Virgins had this sort of unique position where they were not being controlled by a husband or a father, the way other women in their society were, and they were granted um, a certain amount of respect and power that other women also were not. So yeah, there is that sort of like attempt to um, maybe reinterpret that archetype as being, the woman who does not um, need a man, who is independent, who's not controlled by anyone but herself. And Katherine Hepburn, as I've discussed at length, was fiercely independent, and I don't believe she ever had any children. Her marriage was
Hmm.
brief. It's a lot of there's some overlap between Pallas and Vesta, obviously, both of them being virgin goddesses, and both of them being sort of like uniquely positioned in their relationship to men. But even though like they have that power, it's still very much happening within a patriarchal context. in their mythology and in the cult of Vesta that happened in ancient Rome. So that also, I guess, opens up
Yeah,
the question of like, how do we work with these archetypes now? Like, how do we kind of free those archetypes from being under the thumb of the patriarchy?
yeah. Well, and it does make sense. Like, did Katherine Hepburn, she stay married or
No, it was
it's,
very
yeah,
brief. And then she, um, had a relationship, but was not married and, still maintained a fair amount of independence in that relationship.
yeah, that's interesting 'cause, it's like maintaining, like you said, that they're women trying to maintain that independence and I don't know, it's like, I want to say like dignity or their authority or their kind of prominence in the world, but in a male dominated world. And how do you preserve that fire? I mean, when you look at the Vestal Virgins, you preserve that by becoming a virgin, by by not allowing men in your sacred temple, if you
Yeah.
will.
Even in the case of the Vestals, they were essentially abducted as children by the state. The state took them away from their parents as children,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
they had no say,
yeah.
but
No, they're still under
yeah, they're
the
still definitely
under the thumb
under
of
the
a.
control of men. It's just that they're under the control of more privileged men, who've given them
Mm-hmm.
this unique religious role that comes with a certain amount of power. But it doesn't mean that, they're in control of their situation in any way.
So I don't know if you have more to say on Katherine Hepburn, but it seems like a really good segue into my example.
Let's hear it.
So you have Mae West, which, if you're not familiar, very famous actress from like the 1920s, 1930s, into the 1940s. So Mae West has Taurus rising with Vesta exactly conjunct her ascendant, as well as Ceres within just a couple degrees, and then Venus ruling the ascendant in Cancer, applying pretty closely to Juno. So those three very active in her chart, very prominent. So Mae West, a bit of a more than a bit of a sex symbol, huge sex symbol during that time period. It's really known for it's kind of like very scandalously sort of flouting sort of prescribed roles of women, of modesty, right? And she was an early gay rights activist and women's liberation supporter. She was very outspoken about her views, and she really kind of made her career. She like utilized the controversy that she stirred up. She said, "I believe." Well, it's the thing. She was known for her quips. She's very clever, and her kind of body double entendres. Just kind of like oozed sexuality. But she said, "I believe in censorship. I made a fortune out of it." And one of the good examples of that is early on in her career in the 1920s. She wrote, produced, and directed very risque, but commercially successful plays in New York on Broadway. Titles of which include, The Drag, The Wicked Age, Pleasure Man, and The Constant Sinner.
Oh, I love this.
Yeah, very, very religious, very, just challenging that whole archetype, like very visibly.
Well, and the whole relationship between religion and sexuality is very relevant to her career and very relevant to the Vesta archetype.
Well, and it's also probably really relevant that Mae West had Mars in Aquarius in her 10th house, which would be in an overcoming sign-based square with Vesta and Ceres. So,
Shaking things up.
I mean, she's really challenging and rebelling against that, those ideas, because, well, here, that's how it plays out. In response to a very commercially successful play called Sex, just Sex,
Let's get right
religious,
to the point.
Yeah. Local religious groups complained to the city council, and the theater was raided. She was arrested, along with the rest of the cast, and sentenced to 10 days in jail for corrupting the morals of youth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they offered to, let her go by just paying a fine, but she chose to spend the 10 days in jail because she wanted to use the controversy to stir up publicity.
So just love that Taurian stubbornness, getting it
Hmm.
done.
Yeah, and but I don't know, something that I sort of think about with Mae West specifically is, I mean, she was a sex symbol. She was like almost like a sexual goddess kind of the time. Like there were posters of her in a lot of young men and the adult men's bedrooms. She almost in a sense kind of worshipped herself. There's something about the devotional element that is almost like, she becomes like the receiver of the devotion.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, that's kind of true in the case of the Vestal Virgins too, where, um, I mean, they weren't worshipped as gods or anything, but they were given such special
Yeah.
reverence by people in their society because they were so associated with the sacred and with everything that was thought to hold society together.
Yeah.
But, May was reverenced for different reasons, but nonetheless. And there's
Yeah.
like there's that reverencing around sexuality too, where the Vestal Virgins are sort of given reverence because they're non-sexual. May is given reverence because she is very openly sexual.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like she's kind of saying like I can be sexual, you can be sexual, and your fire isn't necessarily being compromised. Maybe that's not the fire. Maybe that's the fire that probably what Mars and Aquarius would say is that, the man is having you believe in, this is
Yeah.
the real fire is within you, or something like that. I don't think she ever said that, but she was very comfortable, taking on that role and challenging, in the 1920s, a society that would have been terrified of a woman like her. But she, they were also, deeply drawn to her. And she was a huge celebrity.
And she's on my list of heroes already. I really knew nothing about her before you.
Yeah, no, she's awesome. I didn't know a ton about her either. But what's the other thing? She also, similar to Katherine Hepburn, never had any children. Also, I mean, she had some complicated relationships. One of which, I mean, I think one of her main relationships actually early on before her professional career, they broke off the romantic relationship, but they stayed friends the rest of their lives. They lived in the same apartment building in to old age, like after they had retired, and just find interesting. By the end, yeah, she divorced her. Well, there's controversy about whether or not she was married to the first one, but she was divorced in the 40s and stayed single until 1980. She died at the age of 80, 84, something like that, in her 80s. Good, healthy age.
I think Katherine Hepburn also remained friends with her husband after their divorce,
Hmm.
which, it's not uncommon, but it's certainly, I mean, it's one of those things like I tend to remain friends with most of my exes, and I'm always shocked that there is still like a weird stigma around that. So I don't know how it was, for Katherine Hepburn or Mae West, during that time period, but I mean, there certainly is like people get weird about it if you're still friends with your ex. They're always like, "Are you sure that's healthy?" And people are really skeptical about it. I don't know if that's connected to the asteroid goddesses in terms of unconventional relationships in any way, but
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, convention would be that you, I don't know, because whose convention are we talking about? But
yeah, yeah, I know. It's like, where does that come from? Yeah, I guess that's it. The convention is you just don't split up, and then I don't know where that idea comes from. I know my own experiences that I run into this fairly often. If I tell people I'm friends with exes, they're like, "Oh, is that?" Is that okay? Like, are you sure that's a good idea? Isn't that weird for you?
Yeah, no, actually, I mean, Vesta isn't particularly prominent for me, but my ex-wife and I get along well. It's a good, healthy co-parenting relationship, and a lot of people think that that's weird. Like, oh, you guys should hate each other or whatever. But it's kind of making me think about Vesta in the sense that with Audrey Hepburn and Mae West kind of having that theme of staying friends with the ex. It's like almost like you're able to, I don't know, maybe they felt like they were able to be respected more when they weren't having sex with the person, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, all of these archetypes really highlight the way women and femininity in general are defined by sexuality and relationships. We don't have any virgin
Absolutely.
gods in our astrological pantheon who are noted for being, unique or special in some way or particularly close to the divine because they're virgins. Like they're all doing whatever they please on that front. They're not really defined by their relationships in the same way. It's never, Zeus is never introduced as the husband of Hera, but Hera is most famously the wife of Zeus.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. What I really love about the asteroids, or what I'm like starting to really love about them, is that even if they did nothing, but just like looking at them and just thinking about these concepts, for both men and women, like how do you relate to these themes?
I mean, this conversation and this research is also really driving home for me as a non binary person just how incredibly heteronormative and cisnormative astrology still is. Like, we're still working with a set of symbols that it's very binary. The symbols that we have in astrology are given very binary gender assignments, and the stories. Especially in the case of the asteroids, because they don't play the kind of role that the traditional planets do. Those roles being more based on how they participate in a system. Like they're based in geometry and sign rulership and stuff like that. The only sort of interpretive um, resource that we have for working with the asteroids is the mythology of their namesake.
Hmm.
And yeah, yeah. So I mean, was really just introduced to the asteroids properly this week. So that's still something that's like in an ongoing way. I'm trying to figure out how do I fit into these symbols and how do I work to change these symbols in such a way that they are more inclusive of different experiences that are not, um, cis normative or heteronormative experiences.
Yeah.
Where do I see myself in all of this?
Um, whatever your relationship to gender, you experience these, archetypes. You're relating to them. I think that a lot of maybe male privilege is not really having to, or not having to recognize their relationship to
Mm-hmm.
these themes and concepts. But you are, it's
Yeah,
there, like, and astrology can be a really good way of maybe drawing your attention to those things. See,
for sure.
how you're interacting with them.
Yeah, so like I have no choice but to grapple with this because it's constantly on my radar. And that's part of privilege is just not really
Yeah.
having to think about it because you're the default. So, that doesn't really set off big alarm bells for you.
Hmm.
Or you're not sort of forced to think about these ideas day in and day out because they're directly affecting, every aspect of your life and making it more difficult and more complicated.
Absolutely. I mean, I know I'm guilty of it to some degree. Like I would like to prefer almost like, oh, my inclination is like, oh, well, the planets are just planets and they have these archetypes, and like I don't really want to think about it as gendered, but yeah, they're all men. They're all men. Like I don't know, like it's
Yeah.
easy. It's easy for me because I live in a culture where male is almost the default kind of gender.
And we do at least have Mercury.
Yeah, androgynous
And
Mercury.
even in traditional astrology, and that all of the planets are given very binary gender assignments of masculine or feminine, but Mercury can be either one,
Maybe that's
depending where
why.
you find it.
Yeah, maybe that's why I read something about. I guess there's a debate in the astrological community, or some segment of it, about whether or not Vesta rules Virgo. Um, I don't know, but I can see where maybe some of that's coming from. 'Cause Mercury, it's like the androgynous planet. Vesta has this association with, at least Vesta, the goddess, has this association with androgyny to some degree. I believe she was called by kind of 20th century, like psychoanalysts, the archetypally the phallic mother, kind of like a desexualized mother, like as opposed to Ceres, who obviously had a baby. She had to have sex to have the baby, but the almost puts Vesta in this sort of different role that we do have, like Mother Teresa. We have these figures in. Oh man, now we have to look at Mother Teresa's birth chart. um, in Roman mythology or in Roman society, Vesta had this association with liminality, like that the space between things.
Yeah, she's sort of like where Janus, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, was the doorway.
Hmm.
She was I guess, the vestibule or whatever you would call it, like another one of the sort of transitional spaces between one place and another.
Yeah, it's like brides couldn't step on the threshold; they'd step over the threshold.
Right, you
Not
don't
to
want to
offend
offend
Vesta.
Vesta
Yeah, like that's the sacred
because
space.
she's the threshold.
I mean, and there's obvious, tie-in to female sexuality, but being between male and female, being between one place and another, and often we have rituals around these kind of transitions. Like a wedding is the obvious example, but like a bar mitzvah, or bat mitzvah, or a graduation ceremony. It's all about kind of stepping over that threshold from one stage to the next. Maybe Vesta maybe lives in that space. That's her space, that in between space is maybe her sacred space. That
Yeah, and there's something that, you can see why people want to give Virgo to her because there is that
mm-hmm.
mercurial quality as well, that liminal quality that we know is a
The
component
Virgin.
of Mercury.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's that obvious one, but I mean, I think Ceres and Vesta are two where people kind of associate them with Virgo. They say they have some affinity with Virgo. Ceres being about the harvest, and Vesta obviously being the virgin. But I guess until now, I hadn't really recognized that quality of liminality as well, and being a deity about transitions, and how similar that is to Mercury as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like it's kind of easier for me to give like the sign, I don't know, give particular sign affinities to the other ones.
Yeah, I haven't really been thinking about them in terms of sign affinities all that much. I know Demetra, in her book, has a few signs, two or three signs that she considers to have some affinity for the asteroids, but I'm too traditional. I cannot untie the signs from the traditional planets.
Well, yeah, I mean, affinity is different than rulership too, but there is
Yeah,
my brain
yeah,
does tend to go a little bit there. Like, oh yeah, which sign can squeeze the most juice out of one of these asteroids?
yeah,
Like I want to,
yeah.
like, but Vesta, maybe I just want to say Scorpio to some degree, but not, nah, I don't know.
That came into my mind too, and then I was like, she doesn't have the aggressive connotations that Scorpio
Well,
does. Like
Scorpio's not
Scorpio's
as,
still
yeah, it's a little more like defensive and protective,
more defensive,
Yeah, like
but
you will not cross.
that's true. That is true. As like a guardian of the threshold, Scorpio is a good sign.
hmm
Like, I am securing this boundary and you are not getting past it.
Yeah, yeah. And I hear like Aquarius thrown around for Pallas a lot. Kind of like that one.
That one's interesting. Yeah, Pallas is the one where I'm like, there really isn't a sign that particularly stands out as having an affinity. Maybe Scorpio, again, for that reason that Athena is more of a defensive war goddess, not an offensive
hmm
one. And she tends to be, not that this is necessarily a Scorpio thing, but um, at least in the sense that, Scorpio is the nocturnal side of Mars and a little bit less direct in terms of how it, or a little more subtle in terms of how it influences or responds to crisis and conflict.
Hmm.
Athena was more known for supporting heroes in their conflicts than fighting herself,
Yeah.
I think.
She also took like a strategic approach when she did fight. She
Yeah,
tended to do better. She didn't actually fight as much as like Mars did, but um, didn't have like
she had to
the
win when she
bloodlust.
did.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
She was gonna win, and she would do it because she had a plan. You know.
Hmm. Yeah, she doesn't fit like neatly into any one of the signs, really.
Hmm.
There are a couple of resources that I want to share in terms of learning more about the asteroids. And I'll include links to both of these resources in the show notes. The first one is just like a general resource on learning more about asteroids is the website of Empress Atlantis. She's an astrologer who works really intensively with the asteroids, and her website is just an incredible resource. And just like it's a library of more resources and more astrologers who work with the asteroids that's just like really well organized. So if you're interested in them, definitely check out her website. And there's also a project called Asteroids of the Gods, which unfortunately seems to be inactive. I think it's been inactive for maybe close to a year now, but this project's blog is still up on Tumblr. And so there's still this whole archive of resources and interesting discussions about the intersection between astrology and polytheism. And as a pagan and a polytheist, I thought this might be worth mentioning. It basically the project has instructions on looking up any of the asteroids that have been named after deities from different traditions on astro.com if you're casting a chart. So if you are a polytheist and say you're a devotee of Dionysus or Diana or Odin, there are asteroids named after those deities, and you can look up their numbers and pop them into your birth chart on astro.com. So people were using that as a tool to think about their relationships with their gods, depending on what house and sign it was in, if there was sort of a message there about that particular relationship or what that relationship is asking of them. So, anyway, check that out. And if you want to know where other gods are in your birth chart, there are a lot of them.
I really like that you're kind of being Vesta for that project. And like found this fire, that's like, oh, it's kind of going out. I want to be the keeper of this fire. So yes,
Yeah.
everyone, please check this project. What's it called again?
Asteroids of the Gods.
Asteroids of the Gods. Yeah, you showed it to me. It does look really cool, and yeah, help Tristan keep that fire alive.
Yes. Yeah, there's a whole archive of experiences that people have shared with their deities and, any insights that they gleaned from finding the position of their asteroids in their birth chart. So that's pretty cool. That's my favorite stuff. I love the lore, but people's personal experiences with their deities is my absolute favorite stuff to read about.
Oh yeah,
And if it also has to do with astrology, then you've just hit all the sweet spots for me,
yeah.
really.
Well, does that end our what would be the word for this? Our audiobook on the asteroids? Not quite.
Yeah, our epic adventure
Yeah.
into the asteroids.
This was an episode of mythic proportions.
Oh,
Yeah, you, Tristan, I know have quite a few things to plug right now, right?
I think just the usual. I think just my actually, I guess I have one additional thing. Um, so you can find me on Instagram at Bad Sign Astrology if Instagram is your thing. And if you are interested in booking a consultation with me, there is a booking link on my website at badsignastrology.ca, and I'll have links to those in the show notes. And I have also started up a blog. So you can find me as Bad Sign Astrology on Tumblr, or you can just read my blog on my website. And I have been writing articles about all the planets where I go through a few source texts starting from the 2nd century and moving all the way up to the 20th century, and do a brief sort of comparison and then talk a bit about how I interpret those planets in my own practice. So yeah, if you want to read those articles on the planets, please
They're
check
excellent,
that
by the
out.
way.
Thank you. Right, I'm supposed to say "and you."
No.
I just sit here staring blankly at you, waiting for you to
Are you
assert
going
yourself.
to ask me what I want to plug?
No.
No, yeah, no.
I'm too
No,
much
actually,
of an Aries for that. It's all about me.
I could. I almost feel like I have one less thing to plug. Not that Killer Cosmos is dead. I just don't want to say that a new episode is coming out. Too busy with this really awesome podcast I've been working on called the Astrology Hotline. You might want to check it out. But also, if you want to book a consultation with me, you can go to my website, KylePierceAstrology.com. And, I got some stuff written on there. You can read that stuff.
Yeah, you got some pretty cool articles about the lunations.
I mean, I don't have like the extensive, historical references, and like I feel like you cited like all your stuff, and it was pretty.
I mean, it's
impressive.
It's still not exactly. Yeah, I don't know if I call it comprehensive. I didn't do it with great scholarly rigor. I mean, I wrote an article a day for 3 days as kind of a challenge to myself. I'd like to thank Porter, our listener this week, who sent in this fantastic question and sent us down this whole path, this like rabbit hole of they might have got more than they were expecting, and I got more than I was expecting. And I think this is just the beginning of a lengthy relationship with the asteroids for me.
Yeah. Thank you, Porter, because I would have probably gone on ignoring the asteroids for a long time, but I feel like I've been converted. I think I'm still figuring it out. And still, I don't know if they're going to be showing up in consultations quite yet, but they are definitely on my radar for keepsies.
Yep, for further research.
Yep. Well, with that, we will sign off, and look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thanks for tuning in.
Can't actually see you. Okay. If you have a question you would like to hear answered on Astrology Hotline, go ahead and send us an email at astrologyhotlinepod@gmail.com.